Welcome. This video provides an overview of preliminary damage assessments for FEMA Public Assistance. We will cover some key topics, including what are FEMA's public assistance programs, who completes preliminary damage assessments for public assistance, how are public assistance preliminary damage assessments conducted, what are the public assistance declaration factors, where can I learn more? First, we'll provide an overview of FEMA Public Assistance and Public Assistance Joint Preliminary Damage Assessments, or PDAs. FEMA Public Assistance provides supplemental grants to aid states, local governments, tribal nations, territories, and certain types of private nonprofit organizations to support swift community response and recovery following major disaster or emergencies declared by the President. FEMA Public Assistance, or PA, provides supplemental federal disaster grant assistance for things like debris removal, emergency protective measures, and restoration of publicly owned disaster damaged facilities and sites. What programs are available and who is eligible? FEMA Public Assistance becomes available when an area has received a presidential declaration of an emergency or major disaster. The four basic components of PA eligibility are cost, work, facility, and an applicant. Cost is the funding tied directly to eligible work and must be adequately documented, authorized, necessary, and reasonable. Eligible costs include labor, equipment, materials, contract work, as well as direct and indirect administrative costs. There are two types of work: emergency work and permanent work. FEMA breaks down eligible types of work into 7 categories. For emergency work that must be completed within 6 months, Category A refers to debris removal, and Category B refers to emergency protective measures. For permanent work that must be completed within 18 months, Category C refers to roads and bridges, Category D to water control facilities, Category E to public buildings and equipment, Category F to public utilities, and Category G refers to parks, recreational, and other facilities. A facility must be a building, public works system, equipment, or improved and maintained natural feature. Finally, applicants must be a state, tribal nation, territorial or local government, or a certain type of private nonprofit. Not all costs are eligible for public assistance funding. Work and associated costs must be due to an immediate threat from or direct cause of the declared disaster. Some costs that are not eligible for public assistance funding include, but are not limited to, loss of useful service life of facilities, loss of revenue, tax assessments, increased operating expenses, general surveys to assess damage, cost of restoring facilities that were not actively in use at the time of the disaster. There are also some eligible costs that are not considered in the PDA cost analysis. Refer to the FEMA PDA guide for more detail on eligible costs. Eligible costs that are not considered in the PDA cost analysis are often referred to as soft costs or administrative costs, such as the ones listed here. Refer to the FEMA PDA guide for more detail on eligible costs. Now that we've discussed what public assistance is and important considerations, let's learn more about conducting public assistance joint preliminary damage assessments, or PDAs. State, tribal nation, or territorial governments are responsible for working with local emergency managers to assess whether initial damage assessment information is complete and aligned with FEMA PDA standards. They also manage the PDA planning process, review damage identified during initial damage assessments, and decide whether they should request a joint PDA from their FEMA regional office. After the joint PDA is complete, the governor will decide whether to request a presidential disaster declaration. Tribal nations can take on different roles depending on how they choose to request disaster assistance from FEMA. They also conduct initial damage assessments and may participate in the joint PDA. For more information about the flexible options for tribal nations, reference FEMA's Tribal Declarations Interim Guidance. Local emergency managers are responsible for gathering information about the location, ownership, occupancy, and insurance coverage of impacted residents and categorizing damage. They must use initial damage assessments to collect data and submit it to their state, tribal nation, or territorial government officials. FEMA regional offices coordinate with state, tribal nation, and territorial officials to conduct joint PDAs. The FEMA PDA coordinator reports to the FEMA Regional Recovery Division Director, often through the Regional Individual Assistance Branch Chief. After the joint PDA, FEMA regional officials recommend to FEMA headquarters whether a major disaster should be declared by the President based on declaration factors. Representatives from all of these groups form the joint PDA team. Representatives from other federal agencies such as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Small Business Administration, and Environmental Protection Agency may also be part of the joint PDA team, alongside subject matter experts such as engineers. The team visits impacted communities and works together to validate damage identified during initial damage assessments. Now that we know who completes public assistance joint PDAs, let's learn how they are conducted. Prior to a joint PDA, local, tribal nation, or territorial governments conduct the initial damage assessment and identify damage. Their jurisdictional leadership review the initial damage assessment and decide whether to request a joint PDA with FEMA. If they decide to request the joint PDA, the governor or tribal nation chief executive will submit a request to the FEMA regional office using the PDA request template. The state, tribal nation, or territory and FEMA will conduct the joint PDA if the request is granted. FEMA and the state, tribal nation, or territory will develop a joint PDA plan of action and choose a methodology to validate damage and address program-specific reporting requirements. Once the joint PDA is complete, the state, tribal nation, or territory requests a presidential disaster declaration and submits the request to the FEMA regional administrator. The FEMA regional administrator reviews the requests and submits their recommendations to FEMA headquarters, who submits the recommendations to the president. The president approves either fully, in part, or denies the request. If the jurisdiction seeks to appeal the president's decision, states and territories must submit an appeal within 30 days of the date on the denial letter. Tribal nations must submit appeals within 60 days. For states and territories, FEMA considers 6 primary factors when evaluating a request for the Public Assistance Program. For tribal nations submitting their disaster declaration request, FEMA considers 11 additional factors. The 6 factors for states and territories are listed here on the screen. For more details on each of these factors, reference the FEMA PDA Guide and the FEMA Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. For tribal nations submitting their disaster declaration request, FEMA considers 11 additional factors listed here on the screen. For more details on each of these factors, reference FEMA's Tribal Declarations Interim Guidance. There are several considerations that you should keep in mind. First, Local governments and tribal nations must use initial damage assessments to establish a strong foundation for disaster declaration requests. FEMA will validate this information as part of the joint PDA if one is requested. FEMA's role in the joint PDA is to validate the IDA data, beginning with the most critical and costly damage. Second, using narrative to explain how damage is related to the disaster and how it impacts the community can tell a compelling story, explaining how federal supplementary disaster assistance is the only way to meet current needs. Narrative explanations are very helpful as FEMA reviews the jurisdiction's request for a disaster declaration and public assistance. Third, the PDA narrative report helps document the full story of disaster impacts. Jurisdictions should do all they can to collect all available information during IDAs. FEMA's public assistance websites provide useful program and policy guides, templates, and resources to support preliminary damage assessments for both programs. Resources include training, checklists, fact sheets, and policy updates. For further details regarding the preliminary damage assessment, reference the FEMA PDA guide. Thank you for watching. Please reach out to the listed email with questions or comments.